I barely looked up when the man sat down across from me. It was a cold, gray Monday morning at the Chestnut Cafe in downtown Philadelphia, the kind of day that makes your bones ache before the first cup of coffee even touches your lips. I had my usual spread, 3 old case files, yellowed at the edges, and a notebook filled with chicken scratch handwriting that only I could decode. At 65 years old, a retired private investigator isn't supposed to have a routine, but I couldn't help it. The silence of my empty house was too loud, so I came here every single morning to chase ghosts that didn't want to be found. "You don't recognize me, do you?" the man said. His voice was quiet, almost lost in the hiss of the espresso machine and the low chatter of office workers grabbing their morning fixes. I finally looked up. He was in his late 30s, maybe 38, wearing a charcoal wool coat that looked expensive but had a slight tear along the left cuff. He had dark hair that was beginning to thin at the temples, and his eyes were a striking shade of hazel. There was a deep, exhausting fatigue etched into the lines around his eyes, the kind of weariness that sleep can't cure. I had seen that look 1,000 times during my career, usually on people who had spent years looking over their shoulders. "Should I?" I asked, keeping my voice flat, the old cop tone I'd spent 40 years perfecting. I closed the file I was reading, a missing person case from 1998 that had gone cold before the turn of the century. The man didn't answer so right away. He reached into a worn leather messenger bag, pulled out a thick manila folder, and set it on the table between us. He placed it carefully, making sure it didn't touch my coffee mug. His hands were long and thin, and I noticed a slight tremor in his fingers as he smoothed the cardboard cover. "My name is Julian Vance," he said, looking straight into my eyes. "And 35 years ago, you and Evelyn Miller stood in Washington Square Park, screaming for a police officer because your 3-year-old son had vanished from the playground. It was January 18, 1989, at exactly 4:15 in the afternoon." The world seemed to stop spinning. The ambient noise of the cafe, the clinking of spoons, the laughter from the booth behind me, the rain tapping against the glass. All of it faded into a dull, high-pitched hum. The date was a permanent scar on my soul, but hearing it spoken out loud by this stranger felt like a physical blow to my chest. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt the cold metal of my old life pressing against my ribs. "Who the hell are you?" I whispered, my voice rough, stripping away all of my professional composure. "I'm your son, Lawrence," he said. I stared at him, my mind racing through a million possibilities, all of them ending in anger or grief. "That's not possible," I said, my voice shaking despite my best efforts. "My son has been dead for 35 years. The police closed the case. My wife, Evelyn, spent 6 years searching for him until it finally killed her in 1995. Do not come here and play games with me." Julian didn't flinch. He opened the folder with slow, deliberate movements, as if he were presenting evidence in a courtroom. "I'm not playing games," he said softly. "I was taken, Lawrence. Sold to a family that moved me around the country. I spent my childhood in Boston and Jersey City under a dozen different names before they finally settled in Newark. The people who raised me, they weren't my parents. They were business associates of the people who took me." He slid a photograph across the table. It was an old Polaroid. The colors faded into a warm sepia hue, the edges soft and slightly frayed. It showed a little boy, about 3 years old, laughing hysterically as a large golden retriever licked his cheek. They were sitting on the stone steps of a brick house. My heart stopped. I knew that photo. I had taken it myself in the summer of 1988, outside our old place on Spruce Street. The dog was Rusty, our golden retriever who used to sleep under the basement stairs because he was afraid of thunder. We only had 2 copies of this photo. One was in a drawer at my house, and the other had been in Evelyn's purse the day she died. "Where did you get this?" I whispered, my fingers trembling as I reached out to touch the worn plastic of the Polaroid. "It was in a box of old documents my adoptive mother kept in the attic," Julian said. "She died 2 years ago. I found it while clearing out her house, along with a photocopy of the original police report from 1989, the one with your signature at the bottom." I looked from the photo to the man sitting across from me. I wanted to believe it. God help me. Every cell in my body wanted to believe that the hole in my life had finally been filled. But 35 years as an investigator had taught me that the things you want to believe the most are the easiest lies to swallow. A photograph can be stolen, Julian, I said, my voice hardening as I tried to regain my footing. A police report is public record if you know where to look. Anyone could have found these. Julian nodded, his expression softening with a mixture of sadness and understanding. I knew you'd say that. You're a detective. You deal in proof, not hope. He leaned forward, pulling back the sleeve of his charcoal coat and his shirt cuff on his left arm. He turned his wrist over, exposing the pale skin underneath. There, running horizontally just below the joint, was a jagged white scar about 2 inches long. You remember this? He asked quietly. I stared at the white mark. I didn't need to touch it to know its shape. He had been 18 months old, trying to climb onto the kitchen counter to reach a box of animal crackers. He had slipped, pulling a ceramic mug down with him. The mug shattered on the tile floor, and he fell right on top of a sharp shard. It took 10 stitches to close the wound at Children's Hospital. Evelyn had cried so hard the doctor had to give her a glass of water. A scar is just a scar, I said. Though my throat was so dry the words felt like sandpaper. It could be from anything. It's shaped like a crescent moon, Lawrence, Julian said, his eyes locking onto mine. Your wife used to tell me it was a special mark, a little silver moon that would guide me home if I ever got lost. She said it every night when she tucked me in. My hands went cold. That was a private detail, a quiet phrase. Evelyn whispered to our boy in the dark of his bedroom when he complained about the itching of the healing wound. It wasn't in any police file. It wasn't in the newspapers. It was a secret between a mother and her son, buried under 35 years of silence. I looked at Julian's hazel eyes, the exact shade of Evelyn's, and for the first time in 35 years, a spark of genuine hope flared in my chest. It was terrifying. I sat in silence, my mind churning like a washing machine. The training I had received during my 35 years in law enforcement was screaming at me to look for the discrepancies. Scammers are always too eager, their stories too polished, their details too convenient. But Julian wasn't pushing. He sat back in the booth, his hands flat on the table, giving me all the space I needed to analyze him. I looked at the bridge of his nose, the shape of his ears, the way his jaw tightened when he spoke. In my line of work, you learn to read the micro-expressions that people can't control. The subtle twitch of a lip, the dilation of a pupil, the slight shift in posture. Julian had none of the markers of a man trying to pull off a con. He just looked exhausted, carrying a weight that had been dragging him down for decades. How did you find me? I asked. My voice barely louder than a whisper, Julian let out a slow breath, his shoulders dropping slightly. It wasn't easy. For a long time, I didn't even know where to start. The people who raised me, they told me I was adopted from an orphanage in Chicago. They had fake papers, fake birth certificates, everything. I believed them until I was 35 years old. But after my adoptive mother died, I found the real documents in her attic. The Polaroid, the newspaper clipping, the police report. That's when I realized my whole life had been a lie. I started digging, but the trail was cold. Then, last year, I did one of those commercial ancestry DNA tests. You know, the ones where you spit in a tube and mail it off. I didn't expect much, to be honest. I just wanted to see if I had any cousins, anyone who might share my blood. He paused, looking down at his coffee cup. A few months ago, the results came back. I got a notification saying I had a close family match, a parent-child relationship. The name on the profile was Lawrence Miller, 65, former private investigator, Philadelphia. You hadn't logged into the system in years, but your profile was still there. I remembered, my partner Roy Higgins had convinced me to do one of those tests 5 years ago when we were working a cold case involving an unidentified body. I had completely forgotten about it, leaving the profile active in some database I never checked. I spent 6 months researching you, Julian continued, his voice steady. I wanted to be sure before I approached you. I read about your career, about the cases you solved, and about the day I vanished. I know what happened to my mother, Evelyn. I know she died in 1995. I know you've been living in this city, carrying this case like a cross for 35 years. I didn't come here to hurt you, Lawrence. I just wanted to find my father. The word hit me like a physical force. Father. I hadn't been called that in 35 years. It felt foreign, heavy, and incredibly fragile. I need proof, Julian, I said, my investigator's brain fighting to maintain control over my emotions. An ancestry website is a start, but it's not enough. People hack databases. They falsify records. If we are going to do this, we do it my way. An independent, certified lab, a legally binding paternity test with a strict chain of custody. I expected nothing less, Julian said. He didn't hesitate, which was a good sign. A fraud would have tried to stall or make excuses. Instead, he reached into his messenger bag and pulled out a small white business card. I already did the research. There's a facility called Gene Tech Labs downtown on 17th Street. They specialize in court-admissible relationship testing. We can go there right now if you're free. I'll pay for the expedited processing. We can have the results in 24 hours. I took the card. The logo was professional, and I recognized the name of the director, Dr. Lisa Hartman. She had done forensic work for the department back when I was on the force. All right, I said, pocketing the card. We do it today. Julian nodded, a look of profound relief washing over his face. For a moment, the tension in the booth dissipated. But then, Julian's expression shifted. The vulnerability in his hazel eyes retreated, replaced by a colder, more focused look. He leaned forward, his voice dropping an octave. There is something else we need to discuss, Lawrence, he said. Something that involves my grandfather, William Miller. I frowned. My father? What does he have to do with this? He set up a trust fund, Julian said. A massive one. It's called the William Miller Irrevocable Trust, established in October of 1988, just a few months before I was taken. He funded it with the proceeds from some real estate sales and inheritance. Initially, it was about $8 million. I stared at him, dumbfounded. My father, William Miller, had been a federal prosecutor. He was a cold, demanding man who believed in rules, structure, and punishment. We had fought constantly, mostly about my decision to leave the police force to become a private investigator. He called it a waste of my talents. When he died in 2010, he left me his house on Pine Street and a modest savings account. He had never mentioned a trust fund. $8 million, I said. My father didn't have that kind of money. He did, Julian said. He was quiet about it, but he had family money from the Midwest. And because it's been sitting in index funds and center city commercial real estate for 37 years, the trust is now worth approximately $141 million. The number was so large it didn't even compute. It sounded like monopoly money. $141 million? I repeated, my voice flat. And why are you telling me this now? Because the trust was set up specifically for his grandchildren, Julian explained. But there's a catch. Under the terms of the trust, the funds are locked until you turn 65, which happened last month. And because I am the only biological grandchild, the money is legally mine. But I can't access it without your consent as the primary trustee. We have to sign a non-judicial settlement agreement under Pennsylvania law, Section 7740.1, to modify the trust terms and release the funds. Julian looked at me, his eyes searching my face for a reaction. I'm telling you this because I need the money, Lawrence. Not out of greed, but because my business is facing a crisis, and I need $8.2 million by the end of the week to save it. If you sign the agreement, we split the trust. $70 million for you, $70 million for me. We can both walk away wealthy men, and I can save my life's work. We walked out of the Chestnut Cafe and headed west toward 17th Street. The Philadelphia rain had slowed to a miserable drizzle, leaving the asphalt black and slick under the wheels of the yellow cabs. Julian walked beside me, his hands buried deep in the pockets of his overcoat. He was a fast walker, but he kept adjusting his pace to match my slower, heavier stride. Neither of us spoke. The revelation of the trust fund hung in the damp air between us like a physical wall. My investigator's mind was running calculations, trying to reconcile the memory of my father, a man who would rather burn a dollar bill than give it to someone who didn't earn it, with the existence of a $141 million estate. Gene Tech Labs occupied the third floor of a modern medical building. The lobby was clean, bright, and smelled of lemon cleaner and floor wax. Dr. Lisa Hartman was already waiting for us in the reception area. She was in her early 40s, with sharp features and dark hair pulled back into a tight, efficient bun. She wore a white lab coat over a gray dress, When she saw me, her face softened into a professional smile. "Lawrence," she said, shaking my hand, "it's been a while. The department hasn't been the same since you retired." "I'm glad to hear it, Lisa," I replied. "This is Julian. We need a paternity test, expedited." She looked at Julian, her eyes scanning him with the clinical detachment of a scientist. She didn't ask questions. In our line of work, you learn that asking why people need a DNA test is a quick way to lose clients. "Of course. We can do buccal swabs today, and I'll put them on the high-speed run tonight. I can have the official report ready for you by 10 tomorrow morning." She led us down a narrow corridor into a small windowless examination room. The walls were painted a neutral beige, and the air was cold. Julian sat on the edge of the examination table, his long legs dangling. I took the vinyl chair in the corner. Dr. Hartman opened a sterile plastic pack, pulling out a long cotton swab. "Open wide," she told Julian. She swiped the inside of his cheek, rotating the cotton tip for about 30 seconds before placing it into a labeled glass tube. She repeated the process with me. Julian watched the entire thing, his throat moving as he swallowed. I noticed the skin around his knuckles was white. He was terrified. I couldn't blame him. If he was my son, this test was the key to unlocking his past. If he was a fraud, it was the key to a prison cell. Once Dr. Hartman had signed the chain of custody paperwork, we walked back down to the lobby. Julian stopped near the glass doors, looking out at the traffic. "I have to get back to Newark," he said, checking a gold watch on his left wrist. The dial read 11:45. "I have a meeting with my investment team at 1:30. We're trying to negotiate an extension on our commercial deposits. If we don't get the extension, the $8.2 million shortfall becomes due immediately." "Go," I said. "I'll see you here tomorrow morning at 10. "Thank you, Lawrence," he said, reaching out to shake my hand. His grip was firm, but his palm was cold and damp. "I know this is hard for you. It's hard for me, too. But we're going to get through this." I watched him push through the glass doors and hail a cab. He got in, and the taxi disappeared into the gray Philadelphia mist. I didn't go home. I drove straight to my office in the basement of my house on Pine Street. The room was dark, the air smelling of old paper, coffee grounds, and leather. The walls were lined with filing cabinets containing 35 years of cases I had worked on, and in the center of the room was my old wooden desk. I sat down and dialed a number I knew by heart. Roy Higgins answered on the second ring. "Higgins," he growled. "Roy," I said. "It's Larry." "Larry." Roy's voice instantly lost its gruff edge. "What's going on? You find something new on the Hernandez file?" "No," I said, leaning back in my chair. "Something else. I need you to sit down." "I'm sitting. What is it?" "My son is alive," I said. A long silence stretched over the phone line. The only sound was the static of the connection and the distant rumble of a delivery truck outside. "Larry," Roy said slowly. "What are you talking about? Julian has been gone for 35 years. He found me, Roy. He sat across from me at the Chestnut Cafe this morning. He's 38 now. He's got the lightning bolt scar from the kitchen accident. He knew the crescent moon story Evelyn used to tell him, and he has a Polaroid of Rusty that only Evelyn and I had copies of." "My God," Roy whispered. "Is it real? We just did the DNA test at GeneTech Labs with Lisa Hartman. The results will be ready tomorrow morning." "But that's not all." "What else?" "He says my father set up an irrevocable trust in 1988. Initially $8 million, now worth $141 million. Julian says he's the primary beneficiary, but he needs my signature on a non-judicial settlement agreement, an NJSA under Section 7740.1, to release the funds because he's facing an $8.2 million shortfall in his investment firm." Roy was quiet for another long moment. When he spoke, the old detective's skepticism was back in full force. "Larry, that sounds too damn neat. A kid disappears for 35 years, shows up out of nowhere, and the first thing he wants is your signature to release $141 million because he's got an $8. $2 million emergency? That smells like a setup from a mile away." "I know," I said, looking at the case file from 1989 on my desk. "Every instinct I have is screaming at me to run the background. That's why I'm calling you. I need you to dig into Julian Vance. He lives in a penthouse in Newark. He runs a company called Reeves Capital Management. See what you can find on his financials, his assets, his history. Anything. I'm on it. Roy said. I still have some contacts at the credit bureaus and the state registry in Delaware. I'll start pulling files right now. But Larry? Yeah? If that DNA test comes back positive, it doesn't mean the rest of his story is true. Keep your guard up. I will, I said. I'll talk to you tomorrow. I hung up the phone and stared at the dark office. The hope I had felt at the cafe was still there, but now it was wrapped in a cold blanket of fear. If Julian was my son, I wanted to save him. But if he was lying to me, I was going to find out why. I didn't sleep a wink that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Evelyn's face, the hollow look in her eyes during the months after the kidnapping, and the small crescent moon scar on our baby's wrist. At 3 in the morning, I gave up on sleep entirely. I walked down the narrow basement stairs to my office, opened the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet, and pulled out the old green photo album. I sat under the dim desk lamp, turning the pages, staring at the few photos we had of Julian. There was one of him in a blue snowsuit, laughing as he fell into a drift. Another of him playing with plastic blocks on the living room rug. By 5 in the morning, I was sitting at the kitchen table, nursing a cold mug of coffee and watching the sun crawl slow and gray over the rooftops of Philadelphia. The house felt incredibly empty, the silence echoing in the hallway. When 9:30 finally came, I couldn't stand the waiting anymore. I got into my sedan, my hands cold on the steering wheel, and drove downtown to Gene Tech Labs. Arriving nearly 20 minutes early, Julian was already sitting in the lobby. He was slumped in a vinyl chair near the water cooler, his leather messenger bag clutched tightly in his lap, his knuckles white. He looked like he hadn't slept either. His hair was messy, sticking up slightly at the back, and he had a dark stubble covering his jaw. He was staring at the floor, his left leg bouncing in a fast, nervous rhythm that vibrated the plastic legs of his chair. When he saw me walk through the glass doors, he stood up quickly, his coat rustling, his breathing shallow. "Lawrence," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "You came." Of course I came, Julian," I said, walking over to him. "I told you I would." We sat in this in silence for 15 minutes, neither of us knowing what to say. The only sound was the low hum of the vending machine and the occasional click of the receptionist's keyboard. Before we could say anything else, Dr. Hartman opened the door leading to the back offices. Her face was neutral, professional, betraying nothing of the massive weight of the results she held. "Lawrence, Julian, please step into my office." We followed her down the quiet tiled corridor. Her office was small, dominated by a heavy mahogany desk and shelves packed with medical binders. 2 printed reports lay in the center of the desk, face down on the dark wood. Dr. Hartman sat behind the desk, gestured for us to sit in the 2 leather chairs, and picked up the folders. She adjusted her glasses, looking at the papers for a long moment before looking up. "I ran the samples twice to ensure absolute accuracy," she said, looking first at me, then at Julian. "We processed the buccal swabs under strict chain of custody protocols. I'll keep this simple and straightforward. The genetic markers show a match probability of 99.97%. She turned the reports over, sliding one toward me and one toward Julian. "In medical and legal terms, Lawrence," Dr. Hartman continued, "the test confirms with near absolute certainty that you and Julian share a biological parent-child relationship. You are his father and he is your son." The room seemed to tilt on its axis. The numbers on the page, 99-97%, blurred together. For 35 years, I had lived in a world where my son was a ghost, a name on a police report, a tragedy that had broken my wife and left me hollowed out. I had spent decades looking at faces in crowds, wondering if my boy was out there, growing up without me. Now the ghost was sitting 3 feet away from me. He had a heartbeat. He had Evelyn's hazel eyes. Emotions hit me like a physical wave, stripping away all of my professional composure. He was real. A choking sob broke the silence of the room. I looked over. Julian had his face buried in his hands, his shoulders shaking violently as he wept. He looked so small in that moment, stripped of the expensive coat and the businessman facade. He was just a boy, crying for the father he had lost, letting out all the fear and pain he had carried. I stood up, my own eyes burning with tears I hadn't shed in decades. I walked around the desk, pulled Julian to his feet, and wrapped my arms around him. He clung to me, burying his face in my shoulder, his hands clutching my back as if he were afraid I would disappear if he let go. He smelled of cold rain, laundry detergent, and stale coffee. I held him tight, feeling the weight of the lost 35 years in the grip of his fingers. "I'm sorry, Julian," I whispered, my voice thick. "I'm so sorry. I should have found you. I should have looked harder. We searched for years, your mother and I. We put up flyers, we hired investigators, we followed every crazy lead. She never gave up. She died in 1995 because she couldn't live with the silence. I'm so sorry. It's not your fault." Julian sobbed, pulling back slightly to look at me, his face wet with tears. "You didn't know. The people who took me, they made sure I was hidden. I didn't know who I was. I'm just glad I found you before it was too late." I wiped a tear from my eye, nodding. "Yeah, we have time now. We have all the time in the world." Julian wiped his face with the sleeve of his shirt, attempting to regain his composure. He took a couple of deep breaths, his shoulders relaxing as he sat back down in his chair. But then, almost instantly, a shift occurred. The raw, emotional boy vanished, replaced by the guarded, urgent businessman I had met at the cafe. "Lawrence," he said, his voice quiet but intense, his eyes darting to the door before returning to mine. "We have time, yes, but my business does not. The deposit deadline for the Newark properties is this Friday. If I don't show proof of funds, I lose the $8.2 million, and the Gashi family, my investment clients, they will destroy everything I've built." I was slightly jarred by the rapid transition from tears to business, but the emotional high of the reunion made it easy to overlook. "What do you need me to do?" I asked. "I've already contacted an estate attorney here in Philadelphia," Julian said, pulling a thick document from his messenger bag. "His name is Leonard Foster. His office is on Walnut Street. He has reviewed the William Miller Trust documents. He has prepared the non-judicial settlement agreement under Section 7740.1. All he needs is our signatures and a copy of this DNA report to execute the decanting process and release the first $16.4 million. We can go to his office right now. We can finalize the paperwork today, and the bank will wire the funds by Thursday morning." I looked at the document in his hand. It was thick, covered in dense legal jargon. I thought of Roy Higgins' warning from the night before, telling me to keep my guard up. But looking at Julian, at his hazel eyes, I couldn't bring myself to doubt him. Not today. "All right," I said, standing up. "Let's go meet your lawyer." We drove to Walnut Street in a heavy, loaded silence. I kept my eyes on the road, navigating the city center traffic, while Julian stared out the passenger window, his fingers tapping a nervous, erratic rhythm against his knee. My mind was still reeling from the DNA test, but my professional instincts, dormant for years, were slowly waking up. There was a friction here, a tension between the overwhelming joy of finding my son and the clinical efficiency of the legal machine he was pushing me into. The law offices of Foster and Associates occupied the entire 14th floor of a gleaming glass and steel tower. The lobby was a masterclass in corporate wealth, thick, dark gray wool carpets that swallowed your footsteps, polished white marble walls with silver veins, and a receptionist who greeted us with a rehearsed metallic smile. The air was dry and smelled of expensive cologne, old paper, and floor wax. On the walls hung large, abstract oil paintings that looked overpriced and cold, designed to project success to wealthy clients who needed their estates protected. Leonard Foster was already waiting for us in a corner conference room that overlooked the city's skyline. He was in his early 50s, maybe 52, with slick-back silver hair, an immaculate navy wool suit, and a deep tan that looked like it had been purchased in Palm Beach. He had a gold Rolex on his left wrist and a pair of customized gold cufflinks that caught the light when he moved. "Lawrence," Foster said, stepping forward with an outstretched hand, his smile wide and white. "It's a pleasure to finally meet you. Julian has told me so much about you, and congratulations on the test results. A miracle, truly." "Thank you," I said, keeping my handshake brief, noting the dry, smooth skin of his palm. "Let's get to the paperwork." Foster smiled, the practiced expression of a man who spent his life translating human tragedy into billable hours. He gestured for us to sit at a glass table long enough to seat 12 people. He opened a thick leather binder and pulled out a stack of documents. "Your father, William Miller, established the William Miller Irrevocable Trust in October of 1988, Foster began, his voice smooth, measured, and dripping with professional authority. The initial funding was exactly $8 million, derived from the sale of several commercial properties he owned in the Midwest. Over the past 37 years, that capital has been conservatively managed, split between index funds and prime commercial real estate here in Center City. As of the close of the last quarter, the total asset value stands at $141,600,000. I stared at the spreadsheet he slid across the table. The numbers were neatly aligned in columns, ending in a string of zeros that made my head spin. I saw listings for 3 office buildings on Spruce Street and 2 retail blocks on Market Street. $141 million, I murmured. My father never mentioned a word of this to me, not when he was alive and not in his will. Foster nodded, adjusting his cuffs, his expression shifting to one of sympathetic understanding. That was by design, Lawrence. Your father was a federal prosecutor, a man of rigid principles. In the trust's supplemental files, there is a letter he wrote in 1989, shortly after Julian's disappearance. In it, he stated that he did not want you to know about the money because he feared it would enable your, quote, self-destructive obsession with finding the boy. He wanted the money to remain locked until you turned 65, hoping that by then the dust would have settled. A bitter taste rose in my mouth. That was William Miller, all right, controlling, secret, and convinced he always knew what was best for everyone else. Even in death, he was still managing my life. He had let me spend 35 years living on a modest PI pension, struggling to pay for ads and private search firms, while $141 million sat in a bank locked away because he thought my grief was self-destructive. So why are we here now? I asked, my voice cold. Under the original terms, Foster explained, leaning forward, the trust assets are to be held in perpetuity until your death, at which point they would transfer to your biological heirs. Since Julian is your only living child, he would eventually inherit the entirety of the estate. However, under Pennsylvania law, specifically 20 Paxixol CS, Section 7741, an irrevocable trust can be modified or terminated by consent of all parties without court involvement. We can execute a non-judicial settlement agreement. Julian leaned forward, his eyes intense, his fingers gripping the edge of the glass table. If we sign this, Lawrence, we split the money now. $70 million for you, $70 million for me. I can use my share to cover the $2 million shortfall and secure my Newark investments. You get your share immediately instead of it sitting in a bank until you die. It's what my grandfather would have wanted if he knew I was alive. Foster slid a thick, bound document toward me. The cover page read Non-Judicial Settlement Agreement, William Miller Trust. This is the agreement, Foster said. It decants the assets, transferring them to 2 new individual accounts. It's 52 pages, single-spaced, detailing the distribution schedules, the fiduciary releases, and the tax implications. I need your signature as the primary trustee, Julian's signature as the sole beneficiary, and mine as the executing administrator. I flipped through the first few pages. The paper was heavy, and the text was a dense jungle of legalese. Terms like decanting, spendthrift provisions, indemnification, and fiduciary liability blurred before my eyes. I need time, I said, closing the binder with a firm snap. I'm not signing a 52-page legal document without reading it first. I need my own lawyer to look at this. Foster's smile faltered, just for a fraction of a second, his eyes flashing with a brief spark of annoyance before he recovered. Of course, Lawrence, that is your right. But I must urge you to move quickly. The fiscal quarter ends in 4 days. If we execute the agreement before the deadline, we can utilize certain tax loopholes that will save you both nearly $12 million in capital gains. If we wait, that money goes straight to the IRS. Not to mention Julian's Friday deadline. I don't care about the IRS, I said, standing up and picking up the folder. And I don't care about 4 days. I care about knowing what I'm signing. I'll take these documents and get back to you. Julian stood up too, his jaw tight, his knuckles white as he gripped his coat. Lawrence, please. This isn't just paperwork. My entire business, everything I've built since I came back to this country, is on the line. If we wait, I lose the Newark properties and I'll be ruined. I'm your son. Don't you trust me? I looked at his hazel eyes, seeing the desperation behind them. It was the same desperation I had seen in the lab, but here in this cold marble office, it felt different. It felt like a trap, and the teeth of the gear were already beginning to close around my leg. "I want to help you, Julian," I said quietly. "But I need to do this right. I'll call you tomorrow." I walked out of the room, the heavy folder clutched under my arm, leaving Julian and Foster staring at each other in the silent office. I sat at my basement desk with a yellow highlighter, wading through the dense legal muck of the 52-page non-judicial settlement agreement. My old wooden desk was covered in henloo pages, and the more I read, the more my stomach knotted. There were clauses in the document that made no sense for a standard family trust distribution. One section, hidden deep on page 34, under decanting provisions, released the executing attorney, Leonard Foster, from any fiduciary liability whatsoever, even in the event of gross negligence or willful misconduct. Another clause stated that upon execution of the agreement, the trustee, meaning me, relinquished all rights to audit the new accounts, inspect the destination of the decanted funds, or request a formal accounting. It was designed to move $141 million out of my father's name and into two separate accounts. But it also built a fortress of a firewall that would prevent anyone from tracing where the money went once it cleared the banks. It was an exit strategy written in the language of estate planning. The phone on my desk rang, the sharp bell startling me in the quiet room. I picked it up, my thumb sliding over the plastic receiver. "Larry here. It's Roy," Higgins said, his voice flat, hard, and devoid of its usual warm sarcasm. The casual banter from the morning was completely gone. "I ran those database checks you wanted. We've got a problem, Larry. A big one." I leaned back in my creaking wooden chair, holding my breath, my eyes fixed on the highlighted pages. "What did you find?" "First, let's talk about Reeves Capital Management, LLC," Roy said. "It was registered in Delaware back in 2019, like Julian said. But that's the end of the line. I called a contact at the Securities and Exchange Commission. There are no filings, no disclosures, no ADV forms, and no reports of assets under management. Under federal law, any investment firm managing over $110 million is required to file these forms annually. A firm managing $90 million for private clients is legally required to register with the state. Reeves Capital is a ghost. It's a paper shell with a registered agent address that belongs to a commercial mailbox rental shop in Wilmington and nothing else." I rubbed my temples, feeling a dull ache behind my eyes. The room felt colder. "What about the audit?" He showed me a report signed by an accounting firm called Bradley and Harrison in Princeton. "I checked the New Jersey Board of Accountancy," Roy replied, the sound of keyboard clicks audible in the background. "There is no firm registered under that name. There never has been." I also checked the names Bradley and Harrison individually in the state registry. Nothing. I even looked up the physical address listed on their letterhead. It's a UPS store in a strip mall off Route 1. The audit report Julian handed you is a complete fabrication. It was printed on a high-end laser printer, probably in Julian's own office, to look official. "And the penthouse?" I asked, my voice barely steady, my chest tightening. "He's renting a luxury place in Newark for $4,200 a month. If the company is a fake, where is he getting that kind of cash?" "That's the most interesting part," Roy said. I ran a soft credit check and pulled a transaction history on his personal account through an old contact at the bank. Over the past 3 years, Julian's account has received regular wire transfers from offshore entities in Cyprus and Malta. The amounts are always just under $10,000, usually around $9,800. That is classic structuring, Larry. It keeps them below the federal banking reporting threshold of $10,000, which would require the bank to file a currency transaction report. But the cumulative total is in the millions. He's moving a lot of money, Larry, and he's doing it in a way that suggests he's trying to avoid the attention of FinCEN and the IRS. A cold sweat broke out on the back of my neck. Cyprus and Malta. Those are classic tax havens and international money laundering hubs. Exactly, Roy said. Your son isn't a struggling investment manager, Larry. He's a money launderer, and if he's telling you he needs $8, $2 million to save his business, he's lying. He needs that money for something else. Something dangerous. When you launder money for the wrong people and the accounts go dry, they don't file a lawsuit. They send a cleanup crew. Before I could answer, my cell phone buzzed on the desk. The screen lit up, displaying Julian's name. Roy, hold on, I said, my throat dry. Julian is calling. I pressed the button and put the cell phone to my ear. Julian? Lawrence. His voice came through the speaker. He sounded different. The smooth, confident tone of the Newark businessman was gone, replaced by a raw, breathless panic. He sounded desperate, his breathing fast and shallow. I need to show you something. I know you're suspicious. I saw it in your face at Foster's office. I don't blame you, but please, come to my place in Newark tonight. I have all the physical accounting ledgers, the client contracts, the bank statements. I'll show you everything. You'll see that this is a real business. I looked at the highlighted pages of the trust agreement on my desk, the words no audit glaring back at me. Newark? Tonight? Yes, please. I'm at 1702 Broad Street, apartment 1702. It's the penthouse. Come at 8 Lie. I wouldn't ask if it wasn't urgent. If you don't see the records, I know you won't sign the agreement. And if you don't sign, my life is over. The line went dead. He hadn't waited for an answer, as if he were too afraid I would say no. I picked up the desk phone again. Roy, you still there? Yeah, I heard. You're not going, are you? It's past dark, Larry. That city is their turf. I have to, I said, standing up, my chair scraping hard against the concrete floor. He's my son, Roy. The DNA test proved it. He's running a scam, and he's mixed up in something dirty, but he's still my boy. I need to look him in the eye in his own space and find out what the hell is really going on. It's a setup, Larry, Roy warned. A guy in that deep doesn't invite you to his penthouse to show you accounting ledgers. He invites you there to pressure you. If you go armed. I'm always armed, Roy, I said. After we hung up, I walked over to the small iron safe in the corner of my office, hidden behind an old stack of case files. I dialed the combination, the metal tumblers clicking into place, opened the heavy door, and pulled out my old service weapon, a Smith & Wesson .38 snub-nosed revolver. The steel felt cold and reassuring in my hand. I checked the cylinder, making sure all 5 chambers were loaded, and slid it into the leather ankle holster I had worn for 35 years. I pulled my pant leg down, covering the steel, and took a deep breath. It was time to go to Newark. The drive to Newark took me just under 2 hours, my sedan humming along the NJ Turnpike as the wipers struggled against a sudden, violent downpour. The highway was a blur of red brake lights and spraying water from passing trucks. In the distance, the city skyline appeared through the mist, a cluster of concrete towers wrapped in yellow smog and industrial haze. The smokestacks of Elizabeth burned orange in the dark sky, casting an eerie glow over the marshlands. Before I exited the highway, I pulled over at a rest stop under a buzzing neon sign, my tires splashing through deep puddles, and sent a text to Roy Higgins. At Newark now. 1702 Broad Street, apt 1702. If I don't check in by 9:30, call the Newark PD and tell them to send a car. His reply came back within 30 seconds. Got it. Be careful, Larry. Don't let him corner you. I arrived at the building at exactly 7:45. It was a brand new, luxury high-rise with a glass facade that looked completely out of place in that part of the city, surrounded by worn warehouses and abandoned storefronts. A security guard in a clean black uniform checked my ID at the polished granite front desk, logged my name, and swiped a key card to activate the elevator. The lobby was empty, the air smelling faintly of lemon polish and glass cleaner. The ride to the 17th floor was silent and smooth, my ears popping as the numbers on the digital display ticked upward in the stainless steel elevator car. The hallway of the penthouse level was wide, carpeted in deep gray wool, and smelled faintly of lavender and fresh paint. Apartment 1702 was at the far end of the hall, isolated. A small black security camera was mounted above the door, its green light blinking as I approached, tracking my movements. I knocked twice, the heavy wood solid under my knuckles. The door swung open almost immediately, as if he had been standing right behind it. Julian stood in the doorway, wearing a black cashmere sweater and dark jeans. He looked exhausted, the dark circles under his hazel eyes even deeper than they had been that morning, his face pale in the warm hallway light. "Lawrence," he said, his voice quiet, almost a whisper. "Thanks for coming. Come in. I stepped into the apartment, my hand instinctively dropping close to my ankle holster under my trench coat, feeling the solid weight of the .38 snub-nosed revolver. The place was massive, featuring floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the glowing grid of northern New Jersey all the way to the Manhattan skyline. The furniture was sleek, black Italian leather, and the walls were decorated with abstract paintings that probably cost more than my annual pension. A large glass bar stood in the corner, stocked with premium liquor. It was the kind of apartment designed to scream success, but to a retired investigator, it screamed something else. A display built on borrowed money and desperate lies, a stage set for clients who needed to be impressed. "Can I get you a drink?" Julian asked, gesturing toward a marble wet bar in the corner. "I've got some 18-year-old scotch." "I'm fine, Julian," as I said, keeping my coat on, standing in the center of the hardwood floor. "Let's look at those books." Julian's throat moved as he swallowed. He nodded, his hands brushing against his jeans, and led me toward a heavy glass dining table. A silver laptop sat open next to 3 thick black binders and a stack of financial statements. "I set everything out," Julian said, opening the first binder, his fingers trembling slightly as he turned the cover page. "I wanted you to see the actual contracts. We manage investments for 3 major offshore clients. Reeves Capital Management has combined assets under management of about $90 million. This binder contains the Q4 financial audit, signed off by Bradley and Harrison." I sat down in one of the leather dining chairs, pulling the binder toward me. I didn't open it. Instead, I looked up, locking my eyes onto his hazel gaze, refusing to play along with the performance. "You can stop the performance, Julian," I said. My voice quiet but cutting through the silence of the room. Julian froze, his hand hovering over the laptop keyboard, his eyes wide. "What do you mean?" "I mean your accounting firm. Bradley and Harrison doesn't exist," I said. My voice dead flat. "There is no license registered with the New Jersey Board of Accountancy. I mean your Delaware LLC, Reeves Capital, is a shell. You have no regulatory filings, no SEC ADV forms, and no assets under management. You don't manage $90 million for 3 clients. You don't manage $90. It's a ghost company, Julian. A paper wall built to hide the money." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the low hum of the apartment's heating system and the wind rattling the glass panes. Julian's face went pale, the color draining from his lips. He tried to speak, his mouth opening and closing like a fish, before he finally sat down in the chair across from me. He looked smaller, the confident businessman veneer completely evaporating, leaving only the scared boy underneath. "Lawrence," he stammered, his fingers locking together. I can explain." "I'm listening," I said, leaning forward, resting my elbows on the table. "But don't lie to me again. If you do, I'm walking out that door, and I'm calling the police." "Who are you laundering money for, Julian? And why do you need $8.2 million by Friday?" Julian buried his face in his hands, his shoulders dropping, his breathing fast and ragged. When he looked up, his eyes were bloodshot, filled with a mixture of terror and desperation. "You don't understand," he whispered, his voice cracking. "If I don't get that money, they're going to kill me. Not just ruin my business, Lawrence. They are going to put a bullet in my head and throw me into the Passaic River." Julian leaned back in his chair, his hands trembling so violently he had to lock them together in his lap. The polished, arrogant facade of the successful Newark hedge fund manager was completely gone, replaced by a terrified, hollowed-out boy who looked like he had run out of road. "I was never in Romania," Julian began, his voice barely a whisper, his eyes fixed on his hands. "That was the story my adoptive parents gave me when they got the fake birth certificate. The truth is, I was raised in South Philadelphia in a brick house off Snyder Avenue. The man who raised me, his name was Valon, a senior lieutenant in the Gashi family. The Gashi family is a violent Albanian mafia syndicate operating throughout Jersey City, Newark, and Philadelphia. They took me when I was 3 years old. They changed my name, got me a new social security number, and raised me as one of their own. They didn't beat me, Lawrence. They did something farce. They groomed me. They saw I was good with numbers, that I could solve complex equations in my head when I was 8 years old. So Valon paid for my tuition, sending me to Rutgers to get a finance degree. They wanted a smart, American-born kid who could build their offshore banking network and move their money without raising flags. I was their investment, Lawrence, and I was too young to understand what I was signing up for. He paused, swallowing hard, his eyes darting to the floor-to-ceiling glass window as if he expected a sniper's laser to appear on his chest at any second. I started running their money in 2019, he continued, his voice shaking. I set up the Delaware shell companies, the accounts in Cyprus, Malta, and Tirana. Over 5 years, I moved more than $300 million for them. I took a 3.5% commission on every wire transfer. I made nearly $11 million in commissions, Lawrence. I had this penthouse, the luxury cars, the expensive clothes. I thought I was untouchable. I thought I was part of the family, that I was one of them. And the $8.2 million? I asked, my voice cold. The detective in me keeping the emotional shock locked away. Julian's face crumpled, tears finally breaking free and running down his stubble-covered cheeks. In 2022, I started gambling. It began small, a weekend trip to Atlantic City, a few high-stakes card games in private suites. But I got in too deep. I lost my own money first, the entire $11 million of my commissions, but I couldn't stop. The panic set in, and I started dipping into the Gashi family's funds, thinking I could win it back with one lucky run, but I just kept losing. By last year, I had lost $25 million of Luan Gashi's cash. It was gone, Lawrence. Blown at baccarat tables in Macau and high-stakes poker rooms in Las Vegas. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with a manic, primal terror. Luan Gashi is the head of the syndicate. He found out about the missing money in October. He didn't beat me. He didn't threaten to break my legs. He just sat me down at a shipping warehouse in Port Newark, showed me a photo of my adoptive mother's grave, and placed a single 9mm bullet on the table. He told me I had until January 22, 2025, to return the full $25 million. If the money isn't in his account by then, he'll execute me. The $8.2 million I asked you for. That's the installment Luan demanded as a show of good faith by this Friday. If I don't pay him that $8.2 million, he won't wait until January 22. He'll kill me tonight. The pieces of the puzzle fell into place with a sickening click, but instead of giving me clarity, they brought a cold, suffocating weight. My son was a money launderer for the Albanian mob, and he had been sent to me not out of love, but out of absolute survival. So you found me, I said, my voice heavy with disgust. You did the DNA test in 2022 to find a mark. You targeted my father's trust. Julian shook his head quickly, reaching out across the table. No, yes, I did the DNA test in 2022 because I wanted to know where I came from. But when the match came back and I saw your name, Lawrence Miller, I did the research. I found out about the William Miller Trust. I realized my grandfather had left $141 million sitting in a bank. I didn't want to use you. I wanted to tell you the truth. But when Gashi gave me the death sentence, I had no choice. The trust is my only way out. He leaned across the table, reaching out to touch my arm, but I pulled back, the movement sharp and hostile. Julian's hand hovered in the air before dropping back to the glass table. Please, Lawrence, he begged, tears spilling over his eyelashes. I know I lied to you. I know I'm a criminal, but the Gashi family raised me to be this. I never had a normal life. I never had a father to protect me. I'm your biological son. The DNA test proved it. If you sign the NJSA under Section 7740.1, we split the $141 million. Gashi gets his $25 million, I get my life back, and you walk away with $70 million. Everyone wins. Please, don't let them kill me. I stood up, my chest tight, my heart hammering against my ribs. I looked at the luxury apartment, the expensive art, and the man who was my son, yet felt like a stranger. My mind was screaming. Evelyn had died of a broken heart because this boy was taken. And he had been raised by the very monsters who stole him, only to return to me as a predator, trying to steal my father's legacy to pay off his gambling debts to the mafia. I'm going home, Julian, I said quietly, turning toward the door. Lawrence, he cried, standing up, his chair falling backward onto the floor. If you walk out that door, I'm dead. I need to think, I said, not looking back as I opened the door and walked out into the corridor. I'll call you in the morning. The drive back to Philadelphia was a blur of rain and red brake lights. I kept my hand on the steering wheel, my knuckles white, my mind spinning through the nightmare Julian had just laid out. The wheels of my sedan hummed along the metal grating of the Benjamin Franklin Bridge, the suspension cables glistening like silver threads in the storm. The city skyline was dark and foreboding. I called Roy Higgins as soon as I crossed back into the city limits, parking under a street lamp off 5th Street. "Roy," I said, the phone pressed hard to my ear. "It's worse than we thought. Much worse. He's not just running a scam, Roy. He's a hostage." I explained everything. The Gashi Syndicate, the childhood in South Philly under Gashi, the Rutgers degree paid for by mob cash, the $300 million laundered since 2019, the gambling debt, and the $25 million death sentence from Gashi. I could hear Roy's heavy breathing on the other end of the line, the familiar sound of an old cop who knew exactly how these stories usually ended, with a body in the river and a family left in ruins. "God help us, Larry," Roy said, his voice rough and low. "The Gashi family, they're animals. They don't negotiate and they don't compromise. If Julian owes them $25 million and the deadline is January 22, he's a dead man walking. And now they're using him to get to your father's trust. If you sign that non-judicial settlement agreement, you're not just helping your son. You are funding a federal crime syndicate. Under federal racketeering and conspiracy laws, the moment you sign a document knowing the funds are going to satisfy a mafia debt, you become an accessory. The feds will seize every dime of that $141 million under asset forfeiture laws, and you'll end up in a federal penitentiary for money laundering. There is no version of this where you just hand over the cash and walk away clean." "I know," I said, looking out at the wet, empty Philadelphia streets, the rain reflecting the yellow sodium light of the street lamps. "But he's my son, Roy. The DNA test was 99.97%. If I don't sign, Gashi will kill him. I can't just let them put a bullet in his head. I spent 35 years looking for him. I can't lose him again. He's a criminal, Larry. He's been lying to you from the start. He built this whole reunion story just to use you as a piggy bank for the mob." "I know," I repeated, the word tasting like ashes in my mouth. "But he's still my boy. He didn't choose to be raised by them." We hung up, and I spent the rest of the night pacing the creaking floorboards of my empty house on Pine Street. I walked from the kitchen to the living room, looking at the dark streets, my mind tracing the legal and physical angles, finding no exit. The next morning, Wednesday, I was sitting in my kitchen, staring at a fresh cup of coffee that had already gone cold when my cell phone rang. The screen displayed unknown number. I hesitated, my finger hovering over the screen before I finally pressed the answer button. "Lawrence Miller." "Mr. Milford," a crisp, authoritative voice said, instantly raising the hairs on the back of my neck. "My name is Special Agent Victor Thompson. I'm with the Federal Bureau of Investigation here in Philadelphia." My pulse quickened, a cold knot tightening in my stomach. "What can I do for you, Agent Thompson?" "I need you to come to our field office at 601 Market Street this morning at 10, Thompson said, his tone polite, but leaving no room for argument. "We need to talk about your son, Julian Vance, also known as Julian Miller, and we need to talk about the William Miller Trust." I swallowed hard, looking at the cold coffee. "What about him?" "For the past 18 months, our organized crime task force has been running a RICO investigation called Operation Silent Ledger," Thompson explained. "Our primary target is Gashi and the Gashi organization. We've had wiretap authority on several members of the syndicate, and Julian Vance is one of our key subjects. We've been tracking his money laundering operations since July of 2023. We know his accounts, his shell companies, and his debt." I sat in silence, the kitchen clock ticking too loud on the wall, the sound filling the small room. "We know Julian approached you at the Chestnut Cafe," Agent Thompson continued, his voice calm and steady. "We also know you went to Gene Tech Labs for a paternity test and that you visited his penthouse in Newark last night. And Mr. Miller, we know your associate, Roy Higgins, bypassed Julian's computer security yesterday morning to download his financial files. Our cyber team flagged the remote access IP immediately. We could arrest both you and Higgins right now for federal computer intrusion and obstruction of justice." My breath caught in my throat. "Are you going to?" "No," Thompson said. "We're not interested in you or Higgins, but we are interested in Gashi. And right now, your son is caught in the middle of a war. I have Assistant U.S. Attorney Sandra Patel here with me. We have some information you need to see. But whatever Julian has told you, and whatever his lawyer Leonard Foster has asked you to sign, do not sign it. Don't give them a single dollar. If you execute that trust modification, you will be violating federal law, and we won't be able to protect you or your assets. I understand, I said, my voice barely a whisper, the weight of the federal government pressing down on me. I'll be there at 10. Good, Thompson said. See you then. I hung up the phone and looked down at my hands. They were shaking. I had spent 35 years chasing criminals, believing in the clear line between right and wrong. Now, the line was gone. My son was a target of the FBI, a hostage to the mafia, and the only way to save his life was to walk into a federal building and make a deal with the government. The William J. Green, Jr. Federal Building sat at the corner of 6th and Arch Streets, a massive block of dark concrete and tinted glass that looked designed to withstand a military siege. I parked in the visitor lot, showed my old police credentials to the armed guards at the security gate, and passed through the heavy metal detectors in the lobby. The elevator ride to the 4th floor was quiet, and when the doors opened, the dry institutional air of the FBI field office hit me, smelling of ozone, old paper, and commercial carpet cleaner. White noise machines hummed in the ceiling tiles, a low static that drowned out the secrets being discussed behind the glass walls. Special Agent Victor Thompson met me in the lobby. He was in his mid-40s, with short brown hair cropped close to the skull, tired eyes, and a neat navy wool suit that matched the FBI credentials clipped to his belt. "Mr. Miller," Thompson said, shaking my hand with a firm, practiced grip that carried no warmth but a lot of weight. "Thanks for coming. Follow me." He led me down a maze of carpeted corridors to a small, windowless conference room. Assistant U.S. Attorney Sandra Patel was already seated at the table, her laptop open next to several thick manila folders and a stack of financial binders. She was in her early 40s, wearing wire-rimmed glasses, her dark hair pulled back into a neat braid. Her expression was polite but completely clinical, the look of a prosecutor who dealt in evidence, not empathy. "Please sit down, Lawrence," Patel said, gesturing to the vinyl chair across from her. "We appreciate your cooperation. I know this must be extremely difficult for you given the circumstances of the DNA test." "I'm a retired cop, Sandra," I said, taking my seat and resting my hands on the table. "I don't need my hand held and I don't need a lecture. Just tell me what you've got on my son." Special Agent Thompson sat at the head of the table and opened the top manila folder, the paper rustling in the quiet room. "For the past 18 months, our organized crime task force has been running Operation Silent Ledger," he began, his voice flat and professional. "Our primary target is Luan Gashi and the Gashi family. They operate a massive narcotics and racketeering network out of New York, Jersey City, and Newark. We've been building a RICO case, but the hardest part of any organized crime prosecution is tracing the money. That's where Julian Vance came in." Thompson slid a series of glossy 8x10 surveillance photographs across the glass table. I looked at them under the fluorescent lights. The first photo showed Julian standing next to a black sedan outside a diner in Newark, looking over his shoulder. The second was a shot of him sitting in an outdoor cafe with a man in his mid-50s who had cold, dead eyes and a scarred jaw. The third, the one that made my chest tighten, showed that same man gripping Julian's shoulder outside an industrial warehouse at the Newark shipping terminal. His face inches from Julian's, his posture aggressive and threatening. I could see the terror on my son's face, the way his shoulders were hunched, the way his fingers clutched his bag. "That's Luan Gashi," Thompson said, pointing to the older man with the scarred jaw. "The head of the syndicate, and that photo was taken last Friday at a shipping terminal in Port Newark." Gashi was laying out the terms of Julian's survival. A USA Sandra Patel turned her laptop toward me, showing a complex flowchart of bank accounts, shell companies, and offshore wire paths. "Julian was the primary money launderer for the Gashi family since 2019, Patel explained, her voice steady and professional. "He operated through a network of shell companies, including Reeves Capital Management LLC. Over 5 years, he moved exactly $312,400,000 through offshore accounts in Cyprus, Malta, and Tirana. He took a 3.5% commission on every transaction, which earned him a total of $10,934,000. He lived in a $4,100 a month penthouse, drove luxury cars, and portrayed himself as a successful hedge fund manager to the public. He was very good at what he did. She clicked her mouse, bringing up a spreadsheet of financial logs from casinos in Atlantic City, Las Vegas, and Macau. But Julian had a massive gambling problem, Patel said. It started in 2022. He began losing his own commissions, but by mid-2023, he was completely broke. That's when he started dipping into the syndicate's principal accounts, money he was supposed to be washing and returning to Albania. Over 18 months, he lost exactly $25 million of the Gashi family's cash at high-stakes tables. When Luan Gashi discovered the deficit in October, he gave Julian a choice: return the $25 million by January 22, 2025, or die. She pulled a thick blue binder from the stack, opening it to show detailed logs of players' accounts. "We obtained these records via federal subpoenas," Patel said. Julian was a registered high roller at 3 major properties. He had private VIP hosts at the Borgata in Atlantic City, the Bellagio in Las Vegas, and the Grand Lisboa in Macau. We tracked his player loyalty cards and the wire transfers he made directly from his personal accounts to the casino cages. In November of 2023, he wired exactly $4.5 million in a single weekend to Macau. He lost it all in less than 48 hours playing baccarat. By the time he realized he couldn't win it back, he was in a state of absolute panic, scrambling to cover his tracks by forging bank statements for the syndicate. But Luan Gashi has his own accountants, and they aren't easily fooled. I stared at the screen, the numbers matching Julian's confession word for word. The horror of the situation was settling into my bones, a cold, heavy weight that made it hard to breathe. "So Julian went looking for a way out," Agent Thompson said. "He had done a commercial DNA test in 2022 and matched with you. Researching your father, William Miller, he found the trust fund. He knew the trust matures when you turn 65, which happened last month. The entire reunion, the cafe, the Polaroid, the tears, the scar, was a calculated play to get his hands on that $141 million. If you sign the non-judicial settlement agreement under Section 7740.1, Julian splits the trust, pays Luan Gashi the $25 million, and saves his own life. But Mr. Miller, you need to understand something. The moment those funds are decanted and moved, you are committing a federal crime. You will be violating federal law, and the Department of Justice will seize the entire trust under asset forfeiture laws. We will have to prosecute you for conspiracy." I stared at Patel, my mind trying to process the legal trap she had just laid out. I knew she was right. As a retired investigator, I was well aware of how federal asset forfeiture and conspiracy laws worked. If I signed the non-judicial settlement agreement under Section 7740.1, knowing the money was going to pay off a mafia debt, I would be legally considered an accessory. The government would seize the entire $141 million, and I would spend my remaining years in a federal cell. But my mind was stuck on another detail, a puzzle piece that had been missing for 35 years. "Why did they take him?" I asked, my voice barely audible, the raw pain of the memory tightening my throat. "Why did they kidnap a 3-year-old child from Washington Square Park in 1989? What did they want?" Special Agent Thompson leaned forward, pulling a yellowed, photocopied document from the folder, the paper aged and fragile. "It wasn't a random abduction, Lawrence. It was a targeted hit. In 1985, your father, William Miller, was the lead federal prosecutor in the Eastern District of Pennsylvania. He spearheaded the trial against Besnik Gashi, the founder and patriarch of the Gashi Syndicate. Besnik was convicted on RICO, racketeering, and international narcotics charges, and sentenced to 25 years in federal prison without parole. He died behind bars. The family wanted blood. They wanted to punish William Miller in the most painful way possible. So, 4 years later, they took his grandson. They watched your family, they tracked Evelyn, and they saw their opening at the playground." A cold shudder ran down my spine. The tragedy that had destroyed my marriage, killed my wife, and left me a broken, empty man was a direct result of my father's career. The legacy William Miller was so proud of, the plaques on his wall, the newspaper clippings, it was the very thing that had cost me my son. My father knew this, I realized. He had hidden the trust fund and the letters because the guilt was eating him alive. He couldn't face me, knowing his prosecution had put a target on my baby's back. But they didn't kill him, I said, the words catching in my throat as I looked at the surveillance photos of Julian. No, Thompson said, shaking his head. The original plan was to kill him, but Valin Gashi, a rising lieutenant in the family, intervened. Valin was smart, a pragmatist. He realized that a dead child was a useless asset, but a living one. A child who legally shared the blood of a federal prosecutor in a wealthy family could be valuable leverage in the future. So Valin took Julian, changed his name, got the fake birth certificate through a corrupt contact, and raised him in South Philly under the family's shadow. They groomed him to be their financial administrator, turning your father's grandson into the very thing William Miller spent his life fighting. They used William's own blood to wash their drug money. The irony was suffocating. The Gashi syndicate had stolen my son, turned him into a money launderer, and now they were using him to steal the money my father had hidden to protect him from them. So. What do you want from me? I asked, looking from Thompson to Patel, my hands tightening on the table. A USA Sandra Patel folded her hands on the table, her glasses reflecting the fluorescent light. We want Luan Gashi, Lawrence. We've been building this RICO case for 18 months, but Gashi is insulated. He never touches the drugs, and he never signs his name to the bank accounts. Julian is the only one who can connect Gashi directly to the financial network. We want Julian to turn state's witness. If he cooperates, pleads guilty to 1 count of conspiracy to commit money laundering, and testifies against Gashi, we will offer him a reduced sentence of 5 years and immediate placement in the Witness Protection Program upon his release. It's the only way he survives. If he doesn't cooperate, Luan Gashi will kill him, or we will prosecute him, and he'll spend 20 years in a maximum security prison. Julian is terrified of Luan Gashi, I said. He will never cooperate while Gashi is walking the streets free. He knows Gashi's reach. We know, Agent Thompson said. And that's where you come in. We want to set a trap. Luan Gashi is desperate for the $8. $2 million payment by Friday, and he wants the remaining $16.8 million to clear the full debt. He is personally monitoring Julian's progress. We want you to call Julian and tell him you are ready to sign the non-judicial settlement agreement. But you must demand that the signing take place at Leonard Foster's office on Walnut Street tomorrow. And you must state that you will only sign if Luan Gashi is present in the room to guarantee in writing that Julian's debt is cleared. I stared at Thompson, my heart skipping a beat. You want me to bring an Albanian mob boss into a lawyer's office? In the middle of Center City? Yes, Thompson said, his eyes cold and focused. Gashi is greedy, and he's desperate for the cash. He thinks you're just a naive retired cop who is easily manipulated by his son. If he shows up to witness the signing and take the money, we will be waiting. Our tactical team will occupy the utility stairwells and the adjacent offices. We will arrest Gashi for extortion and conspiracy the moment the signature is done. Once Gashi is in cuffs, Julian will have the safety he needs to sign the cooperation agreement. I leaned back, my head pounding, my temples throbbing. The FBI was asking me to use my own son as bait in a sting operation against a violent mafia don. If anything went wrong, Julian would be killed before the feds could even breach the doors. But if I did nothing, Julian was dead anyway, and the trust fund would be seized. Let me talk to Roy, I said, standing up. My knees slightly weak. We need to make sure the trap is tight. If I'm going to risk my son's life, I need to know you won't miss. I'm not letting Gashi slip. I left the William J. Green Jr. Federal Building and drove back to Pine Street, my chest tight, my mind running through the tactical angles. The gray Philadelphia sky was dark and threatening, the wind blowing yellow leaves across the pavement. Roy Higgins was already waiting on my front stoop, a cardboard cup of black coffee in each hand, his collar turned up against the cold. He looked at my face, saw the tension in my jaw, and didn't ask questions. We went straight down to my basement office, closing the heavy wooden door behind us, sealing ourselves off from the rest of the world. I laid out the FBI's sting operation in detail. Roy sat in my leather client chair, listening in silence, his eyes fixed on the water-stained ceiling tiles. As I spoke, his coffee cup held in both hands. When I finished, he let out a low, long whistle, setting the cup down on the corner of my desk. "Thompson is right about one thing, Larry," Roy said, shaking his head. "If you sign that NJSA as it is, the federal government will tear your life apart. They'll seize everything, and you'll be a felon before the ink is dry. But the sting, it's incredibly risky. Luan Gashi is a professional killer, a psychopath. He doesn't go to meetings unarmed, and he doesn't like being managed. He has a network of associates in the local police and the ports. If he smells even a hint of a trap in that conference room, he'll shoot his way out, and Julian is right in the line of fire. He'll use your boy as a shield." "We need a safety valve, Roy," I said, leaning over my desk and pointing to the open law books. "I've been looking at the Pennsylvania Trust Act. Under 20 Pascals or CS Section 7780.AT, a trustee who has discretionary power to distribute principal can decant the assets into a new trust. My father's original trust agreement gives me absolute discretion over the distribution of the principal for Julian's health, education, and general welfare. I don't need Julian's consent, and I certainly don't need Leonard Foster's consent to decant those funds today. The law allows me to do it unilaterally." Roy leaned forward, his interest piqued, his eyes narrowing as he read the statutes. "What are you thinking, Larry?" "I'm thinking we execute a preemptive decanting tonight," I explained. "I'll draft a new trust agreement, the Lawrence Miller Protective Trust. Under 20 Pascal CS Section 7748, I'll write in a strict spendthrift clause. This clause will explicitly state that the beneficiary's interest cannot be transferred to any creditor, and that the trustee has the absolute authority to suspend all payments if the beneficiary is acting under duress, coercion, or threat of violence. I will wire the $141 million from my father's old trust account at Girard Trust Bank into this new protective account tonight. Foster's agreement will be linked to an empty vault." Roy smiled, the slow, cold grin of a detective who had just found a loophole. "So when you sign the NJSA tomorrow in Foster's office, the money they think they're decanting won't even be in the old trust anymore. You'll be signing a document that distributes assets from a closed account with a zero balance." "It's brilliant." "Exactly," I said. "The NJSA they drafted will be legally void ab initio, invalid from the beginning, because the subject matter of the agreement, the William Miller Trust, will have no funds left in it. The money will be safe in the new protective trust under my sole control. Gashi won't get a single dollar. But Gashi doesn't know that. He'll see me sign the paper, he'll think the wire is coming, and that will keep him in the room long enough for the FBI to move in and lock the doors. We protect the legacy, we keep ourselves legally clean, and we still catch the monster." We spent the next 4 hours drafting the new trust documents. I sat at the keyboard, typing out the clauses with precise cold terminology, making sure every semicolon was in place. Roy verified the notary seals, stamping the documents with his official seal. By 5 p.m., the document was finished, signed and notarized. I logged into the secure banking portal of Girard Trust Bank, entered the 12-digit security token code, authorized the transfer, and pressed the confirm button. 141,600. Zero was moved quietly from the old account into the new protective trust. At 6:30, I picked up my cell phone and dialed Julian's number. He answered on the first ring, his voice high-pitched, breathless, and trembling with panic. "Lawrence, did you read it? Are you going to sign?" "The deadline is tomorrow, Lawrence." "I'll sign, Julian," I said, keeping my voice steady and cold, betraying none of the anger or fear inside me. "But I have conditions. Anything." He gasped. "Name it. I'll get Foster to change whatever you want." "I'm not signing a document that splits $141 million without looking the man who holds your debt in the eye," I said. "We meet at Leonard Foster's office on Walnut Street tomorrow at 2 p.m., and Luan Gashi must be in the room. He must sign a formal release, stating that upon the execution of the trust split, your debt of $25 million is fully satisfied and you are released from all liabilities to the Gashi organization. If he isn't there to sign that release, I walk out." Julian went silent. I could hear his rapid, shallow breathing through the speaker, the sound of a man who felt the noose tightening. "Lawrence, Gashi doesn't do meetings like this. He's a boss. He'll think it's a trap. Tell him he has $25 million reasons to show up," I said coldly. If he wants his money by Friday, he'll be in that room. You tell him that, Julian. Otherwise, the money stays in the bank and Gashi can explain to his people why the wire didn't clear. Okay, Julian whispered, his voice trembling. I'll tell him. Last tomorrow. Walnut Street. Please don't back out. I'll be there, I said, and hung up. I looked at the loaded .38 snub-nosed revolver sitting on my desk. The trap was set. Tomorrow, my father's prosecutor legacy, my private investigator training, and the mafia's greed would collide in a 14th floor Walnut Street office. And only one of us was walking out clean. Thursday morning arrived with a biting, gray wind that whipped off the Delaware River, carrying the smell of salt and cold steel. The temperature had plunged overnight, leaving a thin layer of frost on the windshields of parked cars. I checked my ankle holster, making sure the loaded .38 snub-nosed revolver was snug and secure against my boot, then wore a heavy black wool sweater and my dark trench coat. At 1 p.m. I walked 2 blocks south, my hands buried deep in my pockets, to a utility van parked in a dark, narrow brick alley behind Walnut Street. Special Agent Thompson was waiting inside the cramped rear compartment, surrounded by glowing monitors, radio receivers, and recording equipment. A USA Sandra Patel sat next to a tech specialist who was adjusting a small, flesh-colored wireless transmitter. The air in the van was cramped, hot, and smelled of electronic heat and stale coffee. Mr. Miller, Thompson said, holding up the tiny microphone. We need to place this under your collar. It's a high-frequency transmitter. Our tech team will be monitoring the audio feed from this van in real time, and we'll have a tactical SWAT unit positioned in the utility stairwell on the 14th floor, just 20 feet from the conference room door. I stood still as the tech specialist ran the thin wire down my back and taped the microphone to my collarbone, making sure the transmitter pack was hidden in the lining of my trench coat. We have 6 undercover agents positioned in the lobby, 2 dressed as couriers and 2 in the elevator banks. Thompson continued, his eyes locking onto mine with intense seriousness. But you need to be careful, Larry. Our wiretaps confirm that Luan Gashi is bringing 2 of his personal security detail. They are armed, trained in Eastern Europe, and they have no hesitation when it comes to violence. Do not attempt to engage them. Just sit at the table. Keep Gashi focused on the paper, and let the paperwork do the talking. What's the trigger phrase? I asked, adjusting my collar. Once you see Luan Gashi sign the release paper, and once you have the signed document physically in your hand, you say the phrase, "The signature is complete," Thompson said. The moment those words cross the transmitter, our tactical team will breach the office doors. It will take them exactly 12 seconds to secure the room and put everyone on the ground. Your job is to drop under the table the second you say the phrase. Clear? Clear, I said, adjusting the fit of my coat. Lawrence, a USA Patel said, her voice softer than usual, her hand resting on my sleeve. Julian is still your son, but remember what he did. Don't let your emotions cloud your judgment in that room. Gashi is a predator. If he senses anything is wrong, if he sees a SWAT team, he will use Julian as a human shield. He won't hesitate to kill your boy to save himself. I know what Gashi is, Sandra, I said quietly, looking at her. I'll see you on the other side. I left the van, my boots crunching on the gravel, and walked out into the cold, dry air of Walnut Street. The streets of Center City were busy with office workers rushing to get lunch, completely oblivious to the federal sting that was about to take place 14 stories above their heads. I walked slowly, pacing myself, keeping my breathing deep and steady to control the rising adrenaline. I reached the glass tower at exactly 1:45 p.m. The lobby security guard recognized me from the day before, waved me through the turnstiles, and I took the elevator to the 14th floor. The ascent was silent, the elevator car rising smooth and fast, my stomach dropping with every floor we passed. I could feel the transmitter pack pressing against my lower back. I stood in the back of the elevator, my eyes fixed on the digital floor numbers ticking upward, 8, 9, 10, 11. Each tick felt like a physical weight pressing down on my shoulders. I reached down and adjusted my pant leg slightly, making sure the leather ankle holster wasn't visible when I walked. I could hear the faint muffled static of the transmitter in my ear. A quiet reminder that Thompson and his team were just a block away, watching and listening, I closed my eyes, taking 3 deep breaths, forcing the old police training to take control of my heartbeat. I had to be cold, clinical, and completely detached. The moment the doors slid open, the investigator facade had to be perfect. When the doors slid open on the 14th floor, the quiet corporate wealth of Foster and Associates welcomed me. The receptionist smiled, her silver earrings catching the light, completely unaware of the tactical agents sitting in the service stairwell. "Mr. Miller," she said, "they are waiting for you in the corner conference room. Please go right in." I walked down the long, carpeted hallway, the glass walls of the offices reflecting my trench coat. When I pushed open the door to the conference room, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Julian was pacing near the floor-to-ceiling window, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He looked terrible. His face was gray, a thin layer of sweat covering his forehead, and his eyes were bloodshot. His fingernails were chewed raw, and his expensive wool collar was soaked with sweat. He looked like a man who was standing in front of a firing squad waiting for the command. Leonard Foster sat at the glass table, a stack of folders in front of him. He looked composed, but I noticed he was repeatedly tapping a silver pen against the wood, a fast, rhythmic clicking that betrayed his nerves. "Lawrence," Foster said, standing up and adjusting his tie. "You're early. I like to be early," I said, taking a seat at the far end of the glass table, keeping my back to the solid wall, facing the entrance. "Where is Luan Gashi?" Julian stopped pacing and looked at me, his hazel eyes wide with a desperate, pleading look. "He's coming. Lawrence, he's on his way. He wasn't happy about the condition, but he wants the money. He'll be here." At exactly 2:05 p.m., the heavy glass door of the conference room clicked open. Luan Gashi walked in. He was a tall, imposing man about 55 years old with short graying hair cropped close to a skull that looked like it was carved from solid granite. A jagged, pale scar ran from his left ear down to his collar, a souvenir of some old back-alley turf war in Tirana. He wore an unbuttoned cashmere overcoat over a tailored charcoal wool suit, and his dark eyes were cold, flat, and completely devoid of human empathy. Behind him stood 2 massive Albanian bodyguards in matching black leather jackets. They didn't look at the spectacular skyline view or the expensive modern art on the walls. Their eyes immediately scanned the corners of the room, looking for threats. One bodyguard checked the wooden cabinets and behind the flat-screen TV panel, searching for hidden cameras or microphones, before closing the door behind him and standing with his back against it, his hand resting inside his jacket pocket. He was blocking the only exit. Julian seemed to shrink in his leather chair. He looked down at the table, his shoulders hunched, his breathing fast and shallow, his skin turning a sickly shade of green. "Luan?" Leonard Foster said, standing up and smoothing his tie, his voice carrying a nervous tremor. "Thank you for coming. This is Lawrence Miller." Gashi didn't offer his hand. He pulled out the heavy leather chair directly across from me, sat down with a quiet grunt, and draped his overcoat over the back of the seat. He stared at me for several seconds in silence, his gaze measuring me, assessing the threats, and finding none in the appearance of a 65-year-old retired private investigator. "You're the detective," Gashi said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble with a thick accent. "The prosecutor's boy. You look old, Lawrence. Old, tired, and ready for the cemetery." "I'm old enough to know how this works, Gashi," I said, keeping my hands flat on the glass table, showing no tremor, keeping my breathing deep. "I've seen guys like you come and go. Let's get to the business. I don't have time to waste." Gashi chuckled, a dry, humorless sound that sounded like stones grinding together. He gestured to Foster. "Sign the papers. My accounts in Cyprus are open. The wire coordinates are already verified. Once you sign the non-judicial settlement agreement, Leonard here will execute the transfer. I want my $8.2 million today, and the rest next week. The family doesn't wait." "Not so fast," I said. I reached into my trench coat, pulled out the single-page document I had drafted last night, and slid it across the glass table. It sat next to Foster's 52-page agreement. Looking small but dangerous, Gashi's eyes narrowed, the scar on his jaw turning red. "What is this?" "It's a release of liability," I said, my voice dead flat, carrying the cold weight of my old life. "It states that under Pennsylvania law, the Gashi organization, Reeves Capital, and all associated parties acknowledged the receipt of $25 million from the William Miller Trust. It explicitly states that upon receipt of these funds, Julian Miller's debt is fully satisfied, and that you have no further claims, financial or physical, against him, his business, or his heirs. It's signed by me, and it requires your signature. Gashi looked at the paper, then burst into a loud, mocking laugh that echoed in the quiet conference room. His bodyguards didn't smile. They remained like stone statues by the door, their eyes fixed on me. "You think a piece of paper stops a bullet, old man?" Gashi asked, leaning forward, his face inches from mine. The smell of tobacco, expensive cologne, and stale espresso hit my face. "You think this court garbage matters to me? If your boy steals from me again, I'll kill him in front of you. No matter what is written on this sheet. This paper is garbage." "It matters to me," I said, holding his cold gaze, refusing to blink. My eyes locked on his, "and it matters to the bank. Without this signed release, Girard Trust Bank will not approve the decanting of the $141 million. The compliance team requires a clear record of debt resolution to justify the transfer under federal banking and anti-money laundering regulations. You sign the release, Gashi, or the trust stays locked. You can sign it, or you can walk out of here and try to collect your $25 million from a dead man." Gashi stared at me, his eyes dark with a sudden, violent anger. The bodyguard by the door shifted his weight, his hand tightening inside his jacket pocket. I could feel the cold metal of the microphone taped to my collarbone pressing against my skin. Thompson was listening to every word in the van. A tense, suffocating silence filled the room. Julian was holding his breath, his eyes darting between me and Gashi, his hands clutching his knees. Gashi leaned back in his chair, his dark eyes never leaving mine. He was trying to call my bluff, searching my face for any sign of fear, any flicker of a lie. But my 40 years of dealing with criminals had taught me how to wear a mask that not even a devil could read. I kept my breathing slow, and even my hands resting flat on the glass, refusing to show the tension that was winding up inside me like a tight spring. In the silence, I could hear the hum of the office ventilation and the distant muffled honk of a car horn down on Walnut Street. Gashi looked at Leonard Foster, who gave a slight, microscopic nod of confirmation, reassuring him that the bank coordinates were indeed locked. Gashi grunted, his fingers tapping a slow, heavy beat against his knee before he made his decision. Finally, Gashi's expression relaxed. He let out a short, sharp breath and reached into his inner pocket, pulling out a heavy gold fountain pen. "You have balls, detective," Gashi said, unscrewing the cap with a slow twist. "I like a man who understands leverage. But remember, once I sign this, you sign your part. If the wire doesn't clear by Friday morning, I'm coming for both of you, and there won't be another meeting." He dragged the paper toward him, scribbled his signature at the bottom with a fast, heavy flourish, and pushed the document back across the table. I picked it up, my fingers holding the edges. The blue ink was wet. The signature of Luan Gashi, the head of the syndicate, was clear and bold. "There," Gashi said, leaning back in his chair. "Now sign your part, Lawrence. Let's finish this." I picked up the heavy silver fountain pen Leonard Foster had set on the glass table. The metal felt cold, heavy, and metallic in my fingers, a physical reminder of the finality of what I was about to do. I looked across the table at Julian. His hazel eyes were wide, bloodshot and pleading, his knuckles white as he gripped his knees, his breathing a fast, shallow wheezing. I looked at Luan Gashi, who was watching me with a smug, victorious grin, his chest puffed out under his charcoal suit. He thought he had won. He thought he had bent a retired Philadelphia cop to his will, using my own stolen blood to strip away my father's legal legacy. He thought he was untouchable. I turned the heavy pages of the non-judicial settlement agreement to the very last page, page 52. I placed the tip of the pen on the signature line, designated for the primary trustee of the William Miller Trust. With a clean, deliberate hand, I wrote Lawrence Miller in steady, dark blue ink. I didn't rush. I made sure every letter was clear. I set the silver pen down on the glass with a quiet click. I sat back, looked straight into Gashi's cold, flat eyes, and let out a slow breath. "The signature is complete," I said, my voice clear, steady and echoing in the quiet, tense room. Gashi's victorious smile instantly vanished, his eyebrows drawing together in a sharp line. He was a professional criminal who had spent decades surviving in a violent underworld. His survival instincts were sharp. He saw the complete lack of fear in my eyes, the cold, steady look of a hunter, and he knew instantly that something was wrong. His hand began to twitch toward his chest. "What did you say? What is that?" Before Gashi could stand, a thunderous crash exploded through the conference room doors. The double glass doors were kicked clean off their hinges by a heavy steel breaching ram, shattering into a million sparkling, diamond-like crystals that rained across the gray carpet. A flashbang grenade detonated in the corridor, the blinding light and deafening blast filling the room with white smoke. "FBI, nobody move. Hands in the air. Get on the floor." A dozen tactical SWAT officers in heavy black body armor, helmets, and protective visors flooded the room, their assault rifles raised, the red laser sights cutting bright lines through the rising smoke and dust. Gashi's bodyguards reacted with the speed of trained soldiers, their instincts overriding their panic. The guard standing by the mahogany door drew a black Glock from his shoulder holster under his leather jacket, but he didn't even have time to bring the weapon to bear. Two tactical officers slammed into him, pinning him against the drywall. The plaster cracked under the impact, and his weapon flew across the room, clattering against the glass. He was forced to the floor, his face pressed hard into the carpet as an officer kneeled on his back, clicking handcuffs onto his wrists. The second bodyguard reached under his leather jacket, his hand on his weapon, but a SWAT officer struck him across the collarbone with the heavy butt of his rifle. The guard let out a choked cry, crashing sideways onto the glass conference table. The heavy glass cracked under his weight with a loud, splitting sound, spiderwebbing in all directions. Gashi didn't look at his men. His face was twisted in a snarl of pure, feral fury as his eyes locked onto mine. His hand darted inside his charcoal jacket, reaching for the silver automatic pistol nestled in his shoulder holster, but my retired investigator reflexes, honed by 40 years of street work, were faster. I dropped to my left knee, my hands sliding under my pant leg. My fingers wrapped around the checkered grip of my Smith & Wesson .38 snub-nosed revolver. I pulled it free from the ankle holster, rose and pointed the steel barrel directly at Gashi's forehead. The hammer was back. My finger was on the trigger. "Don't do it, Luan," I said, my voice dead flat, carrying no hesitation. "I will put a bullet in your skull before you clear leather. It's over. Look around you." Gashi froze, his body locked in place. His hand remained wrapped around the grip of his pistol under his arm, his chest rising and falling in heavy, ragged gasps. He looked at the black opening of my revolver's barrel, then up at my eyes. He saw the cold determination of a father who was protecting his son, a man who had nothing left to lose. Slowly, Gashi pulled his hand away from his jacket, spreading his fingers, and raised both hands in the air. "Down! On the ground! Now!" A tactical officer screamed, rushing Gashi from the side, his rifle pointed at Gashi's chest. The officer grabbed Gashi's right arm, twisting it violently behind his back, and slammed him chest first onto the cracked glass table. Another officer moved in, pulling Gashi's other arm back and clicking the steel handcuffs around his wrists. Gashi spat blood onto the glass, his face twisted in a mask of pure, venomous hatred as he stared at me. "You old bastard," he hissed. "You're a dead man. I'll have your head for this. My family will find you." Special Agent Victor Thompson entered the room, his FBI vest strapped tight, his weapon drawn. He looked at Gashi, then at the bodyguards. "Get them out of here. Secure the building." The officers dragged Gashi and his two bodyguards out of the room, their heavy boots crunching on the broken glass. I slowly lowered my revolver, decocked the cylinder, and slid it back into my ankle holster. My chest was heaving, my heart hammering against my ribs, the adrenaline finally starting to fade, leaving my joints aching. I looked under the table. Julian was curled into a tight ball, his hands covering his ears, his face buried in his knees as he sobbed hysterically. He was terrified, stripped of all the Newark wealth, reduced to the small, helpless boy who had been stolen from me in Washington Square Park 35 years ago. The horror of the syndicate's world had finally broken him. The dust in the corner conference room slowly settled, the bright afternoon sun cutting through the haze and highlighting the millions of sharp glass fragments scattered across the gray carpet. The room smelled of cordite, plaster dust and ozone. Leonard Foster sat frozen in his leather chair, his face white, his silver pen still clutched in his trembling fingers, staring blankly at the shattered double doors. Special Agent Thompson walked over to him, pulled a pair of handcuffs from his tactical belt, and tapped Foster's shoulder. "Stand up, Mr. Foster. You are under arrest for conspiracy, wire fraud, and aiding and abetting a criminal enterprise." Foster gasped, his mouth opening and closing in shock, stumbling backward as he stood. "What? This is a mistake. I'm an attorney. I was just representing my client. Attorney-client privilege." "The crime-fraud exception is a beautiful thing, Leonard, AUSA," Sandra Patel said, entering the room with a cold, triumphant smile, holding a folder of documents. "Under federal law, attorney-client privilege does not protect communications made to facilitate a crime. We have wiretap logs of you coordinating directly with Valon Gashi since 2021, and we have the offshore bank record showing $1.2 million in kickbacks wired to your personal account in Cyprus. You're done, Leonard. Your license is gone, and so is your freedom." Two tactical officers cuffed Foster, his gold Rolex scratching against the steel links. They led him away, his frantic protests and legal arguments fading down the carpeted corridor. I walked over to the glass table and knelt next to Julian. I gently reached under, gripped his shoulder, and pulled him out from the dark, cramped space. He stood up shivering, his expensive cashmere sweater covered in white plaster dust and tiny glass shards. He looked at me, his hazel eyes wet, his lips trembling, his hair messy. "Lawrence," he whispered, his voice cracking, "they're going to kill me. Even if Gashi is in custody, his family, they have shooters everywhere in New Jersey and New York. I'm a dead man. There is no prison safe enough." I reached into my pocket, pulled out the release document Luan Gashi had signed just 5 minutes ago, and handed it to him. "Gashi signed it, Julian. Under Pennsylvania law, this is a legally binding release. But more importantly, the FBI has Gashi's voice on wiretaps demanding extortion payments from me. He's going to a maximum security federal facility, and his entire syndicate is being dismantled. Operation Silent Ledger is wrapping them all up today. There won't be anyone left to shoot." Julian looked at Gashi's signature on the paper, a hollow, bitter laugh escaping his lips. "But the money, Lawrence? Gashi thinks the $25 million is being wired. The wire coordinates, they are active. Foster was supposed to execute the transfer the moment you signed. When they realize the bank isn't sending the cash, Gashi's people will execute me in my cell. They will think I ran with the money." I leaned in closer, my voice dropping to a quiet, steady whisper that only he could hear. "The bank isn't sending the cash because the old trust account is empty, Julian." Julian stopped shivering, his chest freezing. He stared at me, his eyes narrowing in complete confusion. "What? What are you talking about?" "Last night I executed a preemptive decanting under 20 Paxol CS, Section 778018, I explained, keeping my voice dead flat, my eyes locking onto his. "I moved all $141,600, Zowan out of the William Miller Trust and into a new protective trust, the Lawrence Miller Protective Trust. Under Section 7748, I wrote in a strict spendthrift clause. The assets are locked in a new Gerard Trust account. They cannot be transferred to creditors, and I have absolute discretion to suspend all distributions. The non-judicial settlement agreement we signed today is legally void. It's a piece of paper linked to a closed account with a zero balance. Gashi won't get a single dime of my father's money, and neither will the government. It's safe." Julian staggered back, his boots crunching on the glass, hitting the glass window. His face was a mixture of shock, confusion, and disbelief. You moved the money? You lied to me? You played me?" "I protected you," I said, walking toward him, my voice softening. "I protected my father's legacy, and I made sure the family who stole my 3-year-old boy didn't get rewarded with $141 million for doing it. If I had signed that paper and let the transfer go through, you and I would both be sharing a federal prison cell for money laundering. Now Gashi is locked up, the money is safe, and you are alive." Julian slumped against the window, his head dropping into his hands, his shoulders shaking as the reality set in. "So what happens to me now? I'm still a criminal. AUSA Patel is waiting down the hall," I said, pointing to the door. "You have one option left, Julian. You sign the cooperation agreement. You plead guilty to 1 count of money laundering. You testify against Luan Gashi and explain how you ran their offshore accounts. They will give you 5 years in a low-security facility, and they will place you in the witness protection program when you get out. Your debt is legally released. Gashi is behind bars, and the money will be waiting for you when you finish your sentence. I will manage the trust, and I will make sure you have a real life when you walk out of those prison gates. An honest life under your real name. Julian looked up, the tears carving clean paths through the white dust on his cheeks. He looked at the signed release in his hand, then at me, seeing the father he had tried to scam. "You're really going to wait for me?" he asked, his voice cracking, looking at me with a vulnerability I hadn't seen since the cafe. "I waited 35 years for you, Julian," I said, my own throat tightening as I reached out to squeeze his shoulder. "I can wait 5 more." We moved down the quiet carpeted hall to a smaller temporary office room that the FBI had secured as a command post. The room was cluttered with portable printers, laptop cables, stacks of files, and cups of half-drunk cold coffee. A federal public defender named Marcus Reed, 42, had just arrived to represent Julian. Reed was a tired-looking man with a rumpled charcoal suit, scuffed leather shoes, and sharp, practical eyes that had seen every version of federal plea agreements. He sat next to Julian at the table, reviewing the thick cooperation agreement Sandra Patel had laid out. The room was quiet, the only sound the rhythmic hum of the building's air conditioner and the rustle of heavy paper as Reed turned the pages, whispering legal advice to Julian, who sat in silence, nodding slowly, his shoulders slumped. "Mr. Miller," Sandra Patel said, looking directly at Julian. "Under this agreement, you will enter a plea of guilty to 1 count of conspiracy to commit money laundering under federal racketeering guidelines. In exchange for your full and complete cooperation, including a detailed deposition of the Gashi syndicate's offshore routing, bank accounts, and your testimony in open court, the government will recommend a sentence of exactly 5 years. We will request that you serve your time at a low-security facility, and upon your release, you will be enrolled in the Federal Witness Protection Program under a new identity. Do you understand these terms and the legal rights you are waiving?" Julian looked at Marcus Reed, who gave a brief, supportive nod. "It's the best deal you'll ever get, Julian," Reed said quietly, leaning in. "I've seen RICO cases where money launderers get 20 years in maximum security penitentiaries like ADX Florence. This deal keeps you alive, it keeps you safe, and it keeps you out of the general population. It's a clean ticket." Julian swallowed hard, his throat dry, then looked at Sandra Patel. "I understand," he said, his voice quiet but steady. He took the black ink pen Reed handed him and signed his name at the bottom of the cooperation agreement. The signature was clean, his hand no longer shaking. It was the first honest document he had signed in 5 years, the end of the fake audit reports in Delaware shell companies. I stood up, feeling a sudden wave of exhaustion wash over me, and walked out into the corridor, my legs feeling like lead. I leaned my back against the cold wall, closed my eyes, and let out a long, slow breath. The weight of the last 4 days was pressing down on my chest, a physical exhaustion that made my bones ache and my eyes burn. A shadow fell over me. I opened my eyes to see Roy Higgins standing in front of me, holding 2 plastic cups of water he had grabbed from the fountain near the elevator. "Here," Roy said, handing me a cup. "You look like hell, Larry. Drink some water." "Thanks, Roy," I said, taking a sip. The cold water helped clear the fog in my brain and cool the dry burn in my throat. "Thompson told me what happened," Roy said, leaning against the wall next to me, his arms crossed. "The decanting trick worked perfectly. Girard Trust Bank confirmed the transfer to the Lawrence Miller Protective Trust account is complete and verified. Luan Gashi's lawyers are already trying to access the old trust assets to post his bail, but they're finding a zero balance. The bank compliance team blocked all their requests, stating the account was closed. They have no idea where the money went." "It's safe," I said, staring at the cup of water, "in the new protective trust. Under Section 7748, the spendthrift clause is locked. The mob can't touch it, the government can't seize it, and Julian can't touch it until he's clean and out of prison. It's a firewall." "You did the right thing, Larry," Roy said, his voice rough but gentle, patting my shoulder. Your father, William, would have been proud of the legal maneuver. He spent his life using the law as a sword and a shield. You did the same thing. You protected the family legacy. You put a mafia boss in a federal cage, and you saved your son's life. Don't beat yourself up that he's going to jail. I looked down at the plastic cup in my hands, watching the tiny ripples in the water. I thought about the 35 years I had spent chasing every whisper, every scrap of paper, every rumor of a child matching Julian's description. I'd spent thousands of hours in dusty libraries, police registries, and cold alleys, all of it ending in dead ends. And now the search had ended here in this sterile corridor, surrounded by tactical agents and wiretap transcripts. It wasn't the homecoming I had planned, but the law had given us a way to survive the wreckage. The trust my father had set up, the very thing that had painted a target on Julian's back, was now the shield that was going to fund his rebirth. "He's going to prison, Roy," I said, looking through the double-pane glass window of the interview room. Inside, Julian was sitting with Marcus Reed, writing out his deposition, detailing the Cyprus, Malta, and Tirana accounts he had operated since 2019. He looked small and tired under the fluorescent light, but for the first time since I met him at the cafe, he didn't look terrified. The panic was gone, replaced by a quiet focus. "He's going to prison, yes," Roy agreed, looking through the glass with me. "But he's going there alive, Larry. And he's going there as a cooperating witness, not a mafia asset who has to look over his shoulder. He has a clean slate when he gets out. You gave him that. It's a hell of a lot more than most fathers can give their boys under these circumstances." I watched Julian through the glass. He stopped writing for a moment, stretched his fingers, and looked up, catching my eye. He didn't smile, and neither did I, but he gave me a slow, quiet nod. The nod of a son who finally understood what his father had done for him, the dad who had saved him. I nodded back. The road ahead was long and difficult. 5 years in a federal facility was a lifetime, and the threat of the Gashi syndicate would never completely vanish. But for the first time in 35 years, I wasn't searching anymore. I had found my son, and this time I knew exactly where he was. 3 weeks later, the wheels of federal justice were turning at a breakneck pace. The federal grand jury in Philadelphia returned a massive 47-count indictment against Luan Gashi, Leonard Foster, and 12 other high-ranking members of the Gashi syndicate under Operation Silent Ledger. The charges were severe: RICO, racketeering, conspiracy to commit money laundering, interstate extortion, computer intrusion, and identity theft. Foster's bail had been denied by the federal magistrate due to his extensive offshore assets and his high flight risk, and he was currently sharing a cell block with the very mobsters he had spent decades helping insulate. Julian remained in protective custody at the federal detention center on Arch Street, held in the high-security wing to keep him safe from any remaining Gashi loyalists. While he waited for his formal sentencing hearing, on a cold Wednesday morning, I drove to the detention center to visit him. The building was a grim block of concrete and steel, sitting in the heart of the city. The security screening was rigorous. I had to pass through 3 separate metal detectors, show 2 forms of identification, and log my relationship before being cleared. It was a harsh reminder of the physical walls that now separated my son from the world he had known. I was led by a corrections officer down a quiet corridor into a small, sterile visitation room divided by thick panes of bulletproof plexiglass. I sat at station number 4, picking up the heavy gray plastic receiver, waiting for the metal door on the other side to open. A heavy metal door clicked open, the lock clanking loudly, and a guard led Julian in. He wore a bright orange prison jumpsuit, but the visual change in him was striking. The manic exhaustion, the nervous twitching of his fingers, and the sweat-soaked collar were completely gone. His hazel eyes were clear, his dark hair was combed, and he looked remarkably calm, his posture relaxed. He sat down across from me, adjusted the orange sleeves, and picked up his phone. "Lawrence," he said, his voice coming through the speaker, clear, quiet, and steady. "How are you holding up, Julian?" I asked, looking at his face under the harsh fluorescent lights. "I'm sleeping, Lawrence," he said, a faint, genuine smile touching his lips. "For the first time in 5 years, I don't wake up at 3:00 in the morning expecting a knock on the door or a gun at my head." I don't look over my shoulder when I walk into a room. The food here is terrible, and the orange jumpsuit isn't comfortable, but it's a lot better than a pine box in the Passaic River. I feel safe. Patel says your deposition was incredibly detailed, I said. She thinks Gashi is going away for life under the RICO guidelines. You've given them a solid case. He is, Julian said. I gave them the keys to his entire financial network. I showed them every shell company, every wire routing, every encrypted digital wallet key. But Lawrence, the FBI found something else when they raided Valon Gashi's old brick house off Snyder Avenue in South Philly. They decrypted an old, dusty hard drive from Valon's personal computer that had been locked in a wall safe. They found a ledger from 1989. I leaned closer to the plexiglass, my throat tightening, the old detective's instincts alert. A ledger? What kind of ledger? Yes, Julian said, his eyes locking onto mine, his voice dropping. It was a record of the kidnapping. It detailed the cash payments Valon Gashi made to have my identity changed and registered under the fake name. The ledger confirmed that they didn't just have a contact in Jersey City to get the fake papers. They had a lawyer here in Philadelphia who handled the legal work. The lawyer who drafted the fake birth certificate, forged the adoption papers, and filed the false registries in Boston to hide me from the local police search. My breath caught in my throat, a cold shock running through my chest. Who was it, Julian? Who did they pay? Leonard Foster, Julian said quietly, his hazel eyes fixed on mine. A cold burning fury exploded in my chest, a hot wave of blood rushing to my ears. I stared at the plastic phone receiver in my hand, my mind racing back through 35 years of grief, the empty bedroom, the tears Evelyn shed before she died in 1995. The attorney who had sat in that Walnut Street office, pretending to be a professional estate planner. The man who had smiled and congratulated me on the paternity test and urged me to sign the trust. Split, he was the very man who had helped the Gashi family steal my baby 35 years ago. He had been Gashi's inside man from the beginning, helping them run the legal side of the abduction and later helping them target my father's trust fund. He was the architect of my life's tragedy. Foster knew, I whispered, the words shaking with a deep primal anger. He knew who you were the whole time. He sat there and watched me cry, knowing he was the one who stole you. He did, Julian said. He designed the trust decanting scheme because he knew Gashi was going to execute me once the money was gone. He wanted to split the $141 million with Gashi, taking a massive cut for himself, and leave you with nothing. He thought you were just a retired, naive cop who would sign anything to save his kid. But he didn't count on you looking at the law, Lawrence. He didn't think you'd check the statutes. Julian leaned his forehead against the plexiglass, his expression softening, a look of pride in his eyes. He didn't count on my father being a better investigator than him. I looked at the hazel eyes of my son. The anger at Foster was still there, a hot, glowing coal in my chest, but looking at Julian, the heat slowly faded into a quiet, comforting warmth. The monsters were behind bars, the truth was out, and my boy was safe. We've got him. Julian, I said, my voice steadying. He's never walking out of a federal prison alive. We'll make sure of it. I know, Julian said. We got them all. 6 months later, the long legal saga finally reached its conclusion in the federal court. The trial of Luan Gashi was a national media sensation, the courthouse surrounded by reporters and TV vans daily. But Julian's devastating testimony, backed by the decrypted digital ledgers from Valon Gashi's South Philly computer, left the defense with no room to maneuver. Under oath, Julian spent 4 days detailing the exact flow of $312 million, exposing every bank account, shell company, and contact. Gashi was convicted on all counts of RICO, extortion, and money laundering, and Judge Richard Callahan sentenced him to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole at a maximum security penitentiary. Leonard Foster, facing a mountain of evidence regarding his role in the 1989 kidnapping, chose to plead guilty rather than face a jury. The judge sentenced him to exactly 25 years in a federal penitentiary, stripping him of his law license and his wealth. Then came the day of Julian's sentencing. The hearing took place in the courtroom of U.S. District Judge Richard Callahan, 60, on the 10th floor of the federal courthouse. The room was quiet, dominated by dark mahogany panels, a high ceiling, and the large gold federal seal mounted on the wall behind the bench. A low hum of air conditioning filled the room, along with the quiet rustle of papers from the lawyers' tables. Julian sat at the defense table next to Marcus Reed, wearing a dark green prison jumpsuit, his hands cuffed to a chain wrapped around his waist. He looked thinner, but calm and resolved. Sandra Patel stood up first, presenting the government's sentencing memorandum. She detailed Julian's absolute cooperation under the agreement, emphasizing that his testimony was the primary reason the Gashi syndicate had been completely dismantled. "Your Honor," Patel said, addressing the bench, her voice carrying through the quiet room, "the government stands by its recommendation of 5 years. Julian Vance was a key asset, but his cooperation was absolute and key to our success. Without his assistance, Gashi would still be operating the ports. We believe this sentence reflects the severity of the crimes while recognizing the extraordinary assistance he provided to the United States." Judge Callahan nodded, making a note in his file, then looked toward the gallery. "Mr. Lawrence Miller, I understand you wish to address the court?" "Yes, Your Honor," I said, standing up from the wooden gallery bench. My legs felt heavy, my knees aching as I walked to the wooden podium in the center of the courtroom. I adjusted the metal microphone, looking up at the judge, then down at Julian, who was watching me with a quiet, pleading look, his hazel eyes wet with unshed tears. "Your Honor," I began, my voice clear and steady, carrying the weight of 35 years of silence. "On January 18, 1989, my 3-year-old son was stolen from me in Washington Square Park. For 35 years, I lived with that silence. My wife died from the grief, and my life was broken. I spent my life looking for him while he was being raised by the very syndicate that stole him. They didn't just take his name, Your Honor. They took his choice. They groomed him to run their money because he was smart, using his talents to build their criminal network. Julian committed federal crimes, and he must pay his debt to society. But he was a victim before he was a criminal. When he discovered the truth, he chose to help the FBI dismantle the syndicate, risking his life to bring Gashi to justice. I ask you to show him the mercy he was never shown as a child. Give him the chance to walk out of prison as an honest man, with a father who is waiting to help him build a real life. Don't let Gashi's legacy destroy him." I stepped back from the podium and sat down next to Roy Higgins, who gripped my shoulder in a quiet, firm show of support. Judge Callahan sat in silence for a long moment, reviewing the files on his desk, his glasses reflecting the light. When he finally looked up, his expression was solemn but fair. "Mr. Miller," Callahan said, addressing Julian, "this court has reviewed your files, your cooperation records, and your father's statement. The crimes you committed were severe, and they caused significant damage to the financial system. However, the circumstances of your upbringing and your substantial assistance to the United States government cannot be ignored. It is the order of this court that you be committed to the custody of the Bureau of Prisons for a term of exactly 60 months. The judge paused, adjusting his glasses. "I will recommend that you serve your sentence at the low-security federal institution at Otisville, New York, and that you be enrolled in the Witness Protection Program immediately upon your release." Court is adjourned. The courtroom remained completely still, the weight of the judge's words hanging in the air. Julian let out a slow, long breath, his shoulders dropping as if a physical weight had been lifted from his back. He looked down at his cuffed wrists, then over at Marcus Reed, who offered a quiet, reassuring squeeze of his shoulder. 5 years was a long sentence, but in the world of federal money laundering, it was a miracle. It was a sentence with an end date, a clear horizon, and a guarantee of safety. A USA Sandra Patel gathered her folders, closing her laptop with a quiet snap, satisfied that the Gashi Empire's financial engine had been permanently disabled. The gavel banged, the sharp crack echoing in the quiet room. Julian stood up as the marshals stepped forward to lead him out. He turned his head, looking back at the gallery. He looked at me, his hazel eyes wet with tears, his lips moving as he whispered 3 words, "Thank you, Dad." The marshals led him through the heavy wooden door, and the lock clicked shut. I stood in the empty courtroom, the echo of the word "Dad" ringing in my ears. I had waited 35 years to hear that word. It wasn't the reunion I had dreamed of all those years ago on Spruce Street, but it was real. It was a start. 5 years later, the main coastline was a jagged line of dark gray rock and dark green pine trees, the cold Atlantic waves crashing white against the shore. The salt air was crisp and clean, carrying the smell of seaweed and damp cedar. I kept my hands steady on the steering wheel of my sedan, navigating the winding coastal highway toward the quiet town of Kennebunkport. It was a crisp, clear October afternoon, the sun casting long golden shadows across the asphalt, lighting up the red and orange autumn leaves on the hills. In the passenger seat next to me, Cooper, a 2-year-old golden retriever, had his wet nose pressed against the air vent, his tail thumping a steady, rhythmic beat against the upholstery. I was 70 years old now, my joints stiffer in the morning, my hair completely white, but my chest felt lighter than it had in decades. The heavy burden of the search was gone, replaced by a quiet, steady peace. Under the Federal Witness Protection Program guidelines, Julian had been relocated here under a new legal identity. But he had refused the random name the marshals suggested. He had fought the bureaucracy, insisting on being legally registered as Julian Miller, taking back the real name that had been stolen from him 40 years ago in Washington Square Park. He wanted the name his mother had given him. I turned off the highway onto a narrow gravel road that led toward the water, the tires crunching softly. At the end of the road sat a small white clapboard cottage with blue shutters, overlooking a quiet, private cove where the waves lapped gently against the pebbles. I parked the car in the gravel driveway, turned off the engine, and let out a slow, deep breath. Cooper let out a soft, eager whine, his paws scratching at the window, desperate to get out. The front door of the cottage opened with a soft creak. Julian stepped out onto the wooden porch. He was 43 years old now, his dark hair showing distinct lines of gray at the temples. He wore a simple gray flannel shirt and blue jeans, his face tanned and healthy from working outdoors. He looked strong and completely at peace. The sharp, guarded, and paranoid look of the Newark money launderer was completely gone, replaced by the calm, steady presence of a man who had paid his debt to society and left his ghosts behind. He saw my car, and a wide, genuine smile broke across his face, lighting up his hazel eyes. I opened the car door, and Cooper scrambled out, running across the lawn toward him like a golden streak. Julian knelt down on the grass, catching the retriever in his arms, laughing as the dog's thumping tail licked his cheek. It was a mirror image of the Polaroid from 1988, a scene I had kept in my pocket for 40 years, finally brought to life. I walked across the grass, my steps slow but steady. Julian stood up, letting Cooper run happy circles around his legs, and looked at me. "Hi, Dad," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Hi, Julian," I replied. We stepped forward and hugged. It was a tight, bone-deep embrace with no plexiglass, no guards, no handcuffs, and no lawyers between us. I held my son, feeling the warmth of his chest, my eyes burning with tears. I could feel the strength of his arms, the physical reality of the boy I had lost. "Welcome home, son," I whispered. We walked inside the cottage, which smelled of cedar wood, pine needles, and fresh coffee. We sat at a wooden kitchen table overlooking the water, Cooper curling up at our feet. "The trust is fully secure, Julian," I said, pulling a thin folder from my coat pocket. "The Lawrence Miller Protective Trust has been managed conservatively. Under Section 7748, the spendthrift clause remains active to protect you, but I have authorized a distribution of $250 to fund the purchase of the local accounting office downtown. The current owner is retiring, and AUSA Patel confirmed that your new identity papers and licenses are fully cleared by the state board. You can start your practice next month, an honest business under your real name. No more shell companies, Julian." Julian looked at the papers, his hazel eyes shining. "Thank you, Dad, for everything, for not signing the NJSA, for the decanning trick, for waiting. I don't deserve it, but thank you." "I told you I'd wait," I said, reaching out to cover his hand with mine, feeling the crescent scar on his wrist. "The money is just a tool, Julian. What matters is that we have time now. We have the rest of our lives." Later that afternoon, we walked down to the rocky beach behind the cottage. The air was cold, sharp, and salty, the wind whipping off the ocean. Cooper ran ahead, chasing seagulls and barking at the incoming tide. Julian found a driftwood stick, throwing it far into the surf, watching the dog plunge into the cold water to retrieve it. I stood on the rocks, my hands in my coat pockets, watching my son laugh as Cooper shook water all over his jeans. I thought of Evelyn and how much she would have loved to see this. I thought of my father, William Miller, whose rigid prosecutor legacy had caused so much pain, but whose trust had ultimately saved his grandson. The law had been our curse, but it had also been our salvation. We can't rewrite the past. We can't erase the 35 years of silence, the grief that took Evelyn, or the dark road Julian had to walk to find his way back. The scars remain, like the little crescent moon on Julian's wrist. But as I watched my son walk back up the beach toward me, the dog running at his side, I knew the dark corridor had finally ended. The search was over. My boy was home.